Yes, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. This is the inaugural episode of A Promoter's Life on the Wrestling Chatter. My name is Jack Farmer, and I am joined by someone I'm sure you're all familiar with, a guy who's done all sorts of things, but this week we're going to chat about you as a promoter. Eric Bischoff, thank you so much for taking the time to join us.
My pleasure to be here. I've been looking forward to it. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Yeah, as mentioned, I know you've done a whole bunch of things, but we want to talk about the promoter aspect of what you've done in your career. And obviously, I believe that starts from a promoting standpoint when you went to WCW and when you got to that executive vice president kind of role. I just want to jump right into the questions, if that's okay. What was it like making that transition from everything else you were doing to getting that position? Was there stuff that you did to sort of put your name into the hat to get that role, to become the guy that sort of ran the show at WCW?
Well, I'll back up a little bit. When people define executives in the wrestling business as promoters, and certainly promotion is one of the things that one does when you're heading up a wrestling company in particular, because it's a live event business, it's a television business, it's a pay-per-view business, it's a licensing and merchandising business. There are all sorts of facets to the wrestling industry, and being an executive, or in my case, ultimately the president of WCW, you have to have a pretty good understanding of each of those business units within the overall company. Now, my first experience with actual promotion, the very first event I ever promoted in my wrestling career was, I think, around 1988, maybe late 87, 88, sometime in there, when I worked for the AWA. And I've talked about this before, working in the AWA at the time was a real blessing for someone like me, because I had no experience in anything outside of sales. So everything was new to me. I was like this malleable piece of clay that could be shaped and formed into whatever shape and form whoever I was working for felt best. And I was eager to learn. And in the case of the AWA, the very first event I promoted, I think, like I said, it was 87, 88, probably 88, was in Mason City, Iowa. And I had that one all by myself. It was a live event, not a televised event, but it was a normal house show, as we refer to them in the industry, but a non-televised live event. And I promoted it in Mason City, Iowa. I had a great card. Wahoo McDaniel was on the card, Manny Fernandez, the Midnight Rockers were on the card. I think the Nasty Boys were there. It was a pretty full card. But knowing nothing at all, having never promoted anything of the sort, I had to learn from the ground up. Now, of course, I learned from Verne Gagne and Greg Gagne and a gentleman by the name of Mike Shields, all of whom obviously had a lot of promotional experience. Mike Shields worked for Jerry Jarrett for a long time. So they all had a fair amount of experience. And they kind of laid out the groundwork for me, gave me my checklist, if you will, of how to promote a live event. And it was it was a great experience for me. I was excited, obviously. It was a big step forward for me. It was Verne, Gagne having confidence in me to kind of let me go out on my own, so to speak. And it was additional responsibilities, which would make anybody feel good in any job. So it was all positive for me. And I learned a lot, certainly I had guidance and mentorship along the way, but it was a real learning experience. And my experience in AWA early on in my career was a lot like that. It was similar in a lot of different respects. Just like I had to learn the live event promotion business from the ground up, kind of learn by doing, as opposed to learn by book or anything else. It was just learn by doing. The same was true with my experience in production. I was fascinated with the process of creating a television show, because as a child of the 60s, I was born in 55, but as far as paying attention to things, I was I grew up in the 60s, when television was kind of like the centerpiece of the communal universe within most families. It's what you did in the evening when you all got done with dinner and you kind of huddled around the only television in the house at the time. We only had one television, It was a luxury to have more than one. And oh my God, if you had a color television, you were the coolest family on the block. I kid you not.
Right.
So, being a product of television, by the time I got to AWA in my early 30s, obviously I had matured a lot and had gotten involved and interested in many different things, but television was still a big part of our lives. It still is today. Different form, but still is. And I was fascinated with the fact that I didn't know how the fuck it worked.
Right.
How do you get those people on those screens, on those little boxes? How does the audio come through? How does it all work? And I use this analogy often, but it's a lot like a microwave. Do you have a microwave, Jack?
Absolutely.
Do you know how it works?
Not at all.
Do you use it?
Often.
All right. It's a perfect example. And
Right.
you're like probably 99.9% of the rest of the population that has a microwave. Everybody uses them. Some people on a daily basis, some people several times a day. Nobody knows how they work. Well, I had to know how microwave ovens worked. So before I ever got into wrestling, I met somebody who worked for a microwave manufacturing company. And I spent an evening having, well, it didn't take a full evening. It took like 2 beers at a dinner at Denny's, something like that, for this person to explain to me just how microwaves work. Now, fast forward, I'm in AWA, and I go into the post-production facility, and I see this big edit board and this big switcher and all these monitors. And I had been to a television taping in the AWA, and I got to sit in the production truck. I was like a production assistant, basically, but I got to sit in the truck, which was like Starship Enterprise. I was on the deck next to Captain Kirk. In this case, it was Mike Shields, who was the show's director. But I got to watch him, call the camera shots as they were happening live. It was all so overwhelmingly cool to me and fascinating because I'd never been exposed to that. Here I'm beginning to learn, not just theoretically how television works, but being in the truck, watching it being assembled as it's actually happening in real time. That only piqued my interest. And then I had to know, okay, you've shot all this footage, you've got all these camera shots, you've got your rough cut, because it wasn't a live show. That particular show was a tape show. Now what do you do with that? Well, because it was AWA, because it was a small company, I got to sit inside the post-production facility and watch how a show is assembled from raw footage. And I thought that was fascinating. Well, now that I knew how it worked, I wanted to learn how to do it. So I started in my free time when I wasn't doing my day job, which was essentially sales and marketing for AWA. I would go in the evenings, and there was a guy there by the name of Polish Joe was his nickname. His name is Joe Chupik. And Joe was kind of like the Kevin Dunn of AWA, if you will. Mm-hmm. And I just sat and watched him. And then he taught me just fundamentals of how to edit a show and how to mix audio and how to dub tapes. When you take this master tape and you've got 147 television, well, we didn't have that many at the time, maybe 127. But you've got 127 television stations around the upper Midwest that want a copy of that show. How do you do that? Well, I learned how to duplicate tapes or dub tapes. So it was a really fascinating process. But again, I got to learn the fundamentals of a very important aspect of the wrestling industry. So you go back to my first day on the job, I was really good at sales, naturally. I always have done. I had to learn a little bit about, not a little bit, I had to learn a lot about the television industry and understand what it was I was selling and how it related to a potential buyer, but that didn't take long. That was easy to learn. So, here I am, a year and a half into the job, having zero experience at all other than being a fan, and I have a pretty good understanding a year and a half later of the sales and syndication, advertising and sponsorship business. I knew how that worked because I was so interested in the production side of things. I had a fundamental understanding of how the production side of things worked. I had a pretty good understanding of how the live event side of the business functioned. So all of a sudden I wake up one day and I'm thinking, well, wow, I've got, 3 or 4 big boxes checked here in terms of understanding the entirety of the wrestling business, not just what happens in a match, and I never got near that when I worked for AWA, but everything other than creative, I had a chance to learn on the job from a mentor, a group of mentors, really, not just Verne, but Greg as well. Mike Shields, certainly, Joe Chupek, without a doubt. I got to learn the fundamentals of the wrestling business so that by the time I got to WCW, even though I was kind of a third string announcer, which is a nice way of saying it, I probably had not more, but I had a broader base of experience across the fundamentals of the wrestling industry than 75% of the executives in WCW who are actually doing those jobs because they'd never done it.
Was there anything that you learned from them specifically, like Verne or on the job there, that when you went to WCW, you were able to say, hey, I saw this at AWA, we need to implement this and make this change? Or was there anything that you said, hey, I saw this at AWA fail, we need to not do that? Any big successes or failures from AWA that you were able to transfer over to WCW?
Not really, because like I've tried to communicate here, I learned the fundamentals, the basics. And fundamentals are fundamentals, and they apply across the board. Now, I did have a very firm opinion about certain things because of the way I was brought up in the AWA, because Verne, we talk about kayfabe and how old promoters often, some of them were really hardcore and believed in kayfabe. And nobody really understands why. It's one of my favorite questions. Yeah. Whenever I hear something, when I read a news headline or I hear a story about something, my first question is, okay, cool. Why? Why is this happening? Why does this person feel this way? Why do we want to achieve this goal? Whatever it is, I want to know why. And one of the things that I learned from Verne, and this was probably drilled into me more than any other lesson, I guess, that I learned in AWA, because Verne was very firm about kayfabe, meaning Verne didn't believe that anybody outside of the people that absolutely need to know, which is really the talent and sometimes the director, the only people that really need to know what's going to happen inside of the ring are the performers themselves.
Right.
Now, in today's world, you would look at that kind of philosophy and go, well, that doesn't make any difference. I mean, that's ridiculous. Why would anybody think that? Well, that's the magic, folks. That's the magic. It's no different than David Copperfield. There are probably and I don't know anything about magic, and I certainly don't know anything about David Copperfield. I don't even know if he's still alive. Hopefully he is. David, if you're out there, I'm sorry, brother. I don't follow your career.
Yeah, and if you are alive, David, like, comment, subscribe, share, all that good stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Come on, join the party, brother. Help us out. Help a brother out. Come on.
Right.
But it would be like David Copperfield, who probably, or any other highly successful magician or performer, an artist, they don't necessarily run around telling the world how they perform their tricks.
Right.
These are illusions. They're art. It's art that they've had to master and in some cases create. So why would you go spill all that to the world and do a DVD and tell everybody, this is how I actually saw this lady in half? See, I didn't really saw her in half, but this is how I created that illusion. Because once you kind of peel back the onion and everybody knows how everything happens, the mystique goes away. And the mystique leads to the suspension of disbelief.
Right.
And once people suspend their disbelief, it allows them to emotionally invest in what's happening in front of their eyes. I firmly believed it because that was the way I brought up. It was the way that I was trained to do play-by-play. Verne Gagne, for example, I wouldn't know when I showed up when we used to produce our shows down in Rochester, Minnesota for ESPN. I was doing color and play-by-play in some cases, not all the time. I was doing interviews with talent at ringside. I never knew where the stories were going, or who was going to win, or who was going to lose, or what the angles were going to be. Because Verne believed firmly, I think, that the most effective way for a color or play-by-play announcer, or in my case, more often than not, as the mean Gene Okerlund of AWA and ESPN, is to solicit genuine, authentic feelings, emotions, reactions to things. So Verne kept me away from the creative side. He wouldn't let me near it. And I wouldn't have thought to ask to go near it. It was off limits to me. It was like Area 51. You know?
Right.
So I carried that belief system, and I still do to this day, by the way. I carried that belief system with me into WCW and applied it to a lot of different things, not just color and play-by-play, although famously, you know, I kayfabed announcers on a regular basis. It used to piss him off.
Right.
Bobby Heenan hated it. And I didn't smarten people up as much as they felt they should have been before certain big things happened. Hulk Hogan turning heel in '96, for example.
Right.
But I did that for a reason. But I took that philosophy, that extension of the way I was trained in the AWA, the way I was brought up into the business. I started applying that to a lot of different things, including the Nitro format. You know, it's better, in my opinion, to keep the audience in a state of curiosity, meaning if you've conveyed to the audience effectively that on any given show, anything can happen. It's unpredictable in nature. I used to talk all the time in creative meetings and in production meetings about the need for what I refer to as spontaneous combustion, things that would just happen from out of the blue that nobody saw coming. Those are emotions. Those are very base emotions, sometimes subconscious, sometimes conscious. Those are reactions that I was trying to get out of people, all designed to create the feeling that you couldn't afford to miss an episode of Nitro because anything could happen. Well, if I can't afford to miss it because anything can happen, what are you going to do? You're going to tune in.
Right.
That's called must-see TV. And it worked very, very effectively. So I don't think there was any one example of a best practices type of business situation that I could recall back and say, yeah, but Verne used to do this. It was everything I learned. It was a philosophy that I brought with me from AWA versus a specific kind of approach to a specific part of business.
You mentioned something, and before going all the way into the WCW stuff, you had mentioned how you promoted your first show. It was a house show with AWA, and Verne liked to keep things separate, the creative and everything. How did that initially happen, that you promoted a show? Did you come to him and say, hey, I've been learning all about TV and I've been learning about the production side of things. I want to learn more? Because you seem like a very hands-on learner. You want to learn by actually doing. Did you come to him, or did he say, hey, look, Eric, we've got more stuff for you. Try promoting a show? How did that happen? How'd that conversation go to actually do it?
There was a real, and again, this is, to take people back in time that certainly don't even remember the territory system. And Verne was one of, not the last, but one of the last promoters in that territory model. Jerry Jarrett was another. There may have been one or two others that were hanging on by their skin of their teeth, but Verne was one of the last ones. And Verne's territory, Verne was based in Minneapolis, so his live event territory, if you will, was the upper Midwest: Minnesota, Wisconsin, North, South Dakota, Iowa, Nebraska, Illinois, to a degree, northern part of Illinois. That was Verne's territory. And I had a good friend who's still one of my closest friends, Sonny Ono, who I knew before I got into wrestling, who lived in Mason City, Iowa. Well, there was a television station there in Mason City, Iowa, which is only about an hour and a half, 2 hours south of Minneapolis. So it was a good live event town. But Verne didn't have any television in Mason City, Iowa, so he couldn't promote live events there. One of the reasons that Verne hired me was to get television in those local markets around the upper Midwest where he didn't already have it, so that he could increase his live event territory and therefore drive revenue. So I knew that Mason City was a great market. I had a close friend, Sonny Ono, that lived there. Sonny was a karate instructor in Mason City, which is a small town. And Sonny knew everybody. He was like the mayor. He was the unofficial mayor of Mason City, Iowa. Everybody knew Sonny and liked Sonny. So I reached out to Sonny and said, "Hey man, I'd really like to try to get Verne's show on TV in the Mason City market. Do you know anybody, in any of at the big local television stations?" Sonny happened to know somebody at KIMT, which is, I think it was a CBS affiliate, but I'm not sure about that. But it was a network affiliate station. And he said, "Yeah, I know somebody there. I'll try to get you a meeting." So he did, and I took the meeting and was able to clear or sell Verne's show into that Mason City market. After we'd been there for a couple months and the ratings were pretty solid, I went to Verne, to answer your question in a long fucking winded way. I went to Verne and said, "Hey, Verne, we've got TV now in Mason," because there was no promoter. There was no official promoter at that point.
Right.
I said, "Verne, I'd like to give that a shot." That's how that started.
Very cool. Now, and then of course it took off from there. Kind of going back to the WCW thing. I've read, you read a Nitro book. I've listened to your interviews with Conrad. They're all great. I know you say one of the first things you did is you asked everyone to see how many pencils they had in their desk when you got at WCW. But my question to you is, was there anything that when you got that position and you had that role that you were excited about doing, that you said, "Hey, now that I'm in control, what's the fun thing I want to do now that I have this opportunity?"
Everything, because in WCW, everything was so broken that it would be hard to try to fix it and not be successful. That's how broken and dysfunctional every business unit within WCW, when I took it over, it was worse than starting from scratch. Right. Now, I had, a distinct advantage, and then it was Turner Broadcasting, and we didn't, we were all being paid by Turner and all of that. So I don't mean to make it sound like, a startup would have been easier than the situation I walked into. But in some ways it would have been, because I had to overcome bad habits. I had to overcome dysfunction. I had to overcome people who had been in their positions for a long time at a high level, who were dysfunctional, and to, I don't want to say retrain them, but to try to manage them in a way that allowed me to change the things that I felt needed to be changed was a fair amount of work. It was not easy. But when it comes to fun, attacking television was fun for me. Looking at the product, because that's what I felt most comfortable. At the time, I didn't feel comfortable at all with creative. So I didn't even think about creative. That was it was still Area 51 for me when I was in WCW until about 1995. Then I started trespassing every once in a while because I had to. But increasing the production value of the show was something that I felt absolutely needed to be done. It was the low-hanging fruit in WCW at that point. And it was the fruit that I felt most comfortable picking, because I probably knew more about production than I did anything else within WCW. I would say that would be it, increasing the production values of the show, making it more watchable, making it more entertaining, even just from a pacing point of view, that type of thing.
You'd mentioned that there were some incumbents there, some people that you had to retrain. How did you go about that? I'm sure there was a lot of people that didn't just say, "Oh, Eric's in charge, I guess I'll just do everything he says." How did you handle the people that, whether or not they'd be more senior than you at the company, but now you're their boss, or people that were just hard-headed? Did you have an approach to deal with people like that? Or did you just say, "My way or the highway"? Did you say, "I'm going to show you I can do this, and then you'll listen to me"? How did you approach those people?
It was a combination, you know, depending on the individual. For the most part, I did not have a heavy-handed approach. You know, at the time in Turner, you would have had to murder somebody in headquarters elevator, step out of that elevator with a weapon in your hands covered in blood before you would have probably been fired. Turner didn't fire anybody, right?
Right.
So for me to come in, my nature is to be a little direct and heavy-handed and just get shit done. If it's in my way, move it or break it or fix it. But don't waste a lot of time either way.
Right.
Just, if you can't get it done, if you can't fix it fast, just get it out of the way. But that approach didn't work in Turner at that time. Culturally, it just didn't work. Corporately, it didn't work. So I had to learn to work around people. I'll give you one specific instance. Gary Juster. Gary Juster and Jim Barnett. You know, Jim Barnett was more of a, I don't want to say a figurehead, but Ted was very gracious to keep Jim Barnett on the staff, even though Jim Barnett really didn't have a job to do in any measurable way. But he was kind of like a consultant. He was Yoda, right?
Right.
But more than anything, it was Ted Turner being a generous person that kept him in that spot. Well, Gary Juster was right underneath Jim Barnett. And Gary was the hands-on promoter. Gary was the guy that promoted live events. He sucked at it. He was fucking horrible. He had no instinct. He had no vision. He couldn't think out of the box. Gary was one of those guys that would just do what has always been done. And if it didn't work, it was because of booking. If it didn't work, it was because TV sucked. You know, he never really reevaluated the way he promoted individual markets. So I couldn't really fire Gary. I guess I probably could have, but it wasn't worth the hassle of having to deal with it culturally or corporately. So I brought in Zane Bresloff, who had formerly worked in the WWF and did know his shit. He knew how to promote. He wasn't doing the same thing that had been done, you know, 10 years earlier and always worked with the same venues, with the same building managers, with the same deals. You know, Gary was on autopilot. You know, you want to go to Roanoke? Okay, he calls buddy at Roanoke, and it would take care of itself. You know, Zane was much more hands-on, and I gave Zane more and more and more responsibility, and took as I gave more responsibility to Zane, I was taking responsibility from Gary, to the point where if Gary would have got hit by a bus, it would have taken a week or 10 days for anybody to notice it.
Right. So you just kind of fixed the problem your way, and then if the problem was still there, it'd figure itself out.
I fixed it in a Turner way. I fixed it without having to fire him.
Right.
Or train him.
Right. Which seems to have worked out. My next question is, you know, is there anything as an executive that you would do or promote or on any of these shows? Performers, they get nervous about certain things they got to do, whether it be in the ring. I mean, even if you're a musician, there's certain things that make you nervous. As an executive, as a promoter, was there anything that you did that made you really nervous during your time at WCW or promoting in general, that you were like, this thing makes me nervous. I'm not sure about this?
No, I mean, I know what you're asking. You know, nothing. Confidence has never, or lack of confidence has never been an issue for me. I've always had a lot of confidence, sometimes more than I should. So I never really got nervous in the sense that I was not sure of an outcome. I often did things and tried things that I knew were pretty risky, but I knew that there was a chance that they were going to fail. So I wasn't nervous about it. I was excited about it to see if I was right, or if it was going to work, or if it would benefit the company or the product. So there was always an excitement, anticipation, but there was also an awareness that, hey, fuck it, this might not work. And if it doesn't, then we'll figure out something else that does. You know, it's kind of the way I approach life.
Are you I guess in general, would you consider yourself the kind of person that has a lot of backups, or are you the kind of person that just, I'm going to get it right the first time? I'm a big backup guy. So like whenever I go somewhere, if I have to wear a suit, I bring 2 suits in case something happens to the first one. I'm one of those people that always has a backup plan. Are you a backup plan guy, or are you like, no, I'm just going to focus on the one thing and I'm going to make sure it's right and not worry about backups?
No, I'm an adrenaline junkie, so I tend to fly without a net in almost every aspect of my life.
Yeah.
If I'm going to go in a certain direction, I'll give you a specific example. One of the first things that I did to enhance the production values of the show was to move a lot of our syndication production from live events, venues in and around the Southeast down to the Disney MGM studios. And I did that for a variety of reasons, all of which had to do with the overall production value of the show. I felt that our syndicated shows were just aesthetically and creatively horrible. Part of the reason for that is because we couldn't draw crowds. We'd have to paper our houses for our TV tapings. Well, when you paper the same markets over and over and over again, Gary Jester, are you listening to me? Lazy fuck. When you keep doing things the way you've always done them, and one of the things that you always did was paper the houses. So every time we went to Anderson, South Carolina, for example, which was a pretty common place for us to produce television, once a month or once every 2 months or whatever it was, well, we just paper the house. Well, what are you telling the fans in that market? Don't ever buy a ticket. There's no need to buy a ticket because they'll always give them to you.
Right.
And because that affected the perception of the product in the marketplace, probably subconsciously as much as anything, it's like, well, they're giving free tickets. If it's free, it must not be that good. I don't think people said that to themselves, but that's how it manifests, especially over long periods of time. And I knew I couldn't fix that overnight. So I shut down all of the live event TV business outside of Center Stage, which was the Saturday night show and the Sunday show. But all of our syndicated tapings, instead of traveling all over the Southeast once a month or twice a month to do them, I shot them all down in Disney MGM studios. I had no backup for that. If that wouldn't have worked, we'd have been screwed. Like all kinds of screwed. And millions and millions and millions of dollars of screwed in the process. But I felt like it had to be done, and I didn't have a backup. Was I nervous about it? Probably should have been, but I wasn't. I was excited about it, but I wasn't nervous. Maybe I don't know the difference between excited and nervous. Maybe that's it.
I think that's the thing. There's definitely a fine line between both of those things. But I like that you mentioned about Center Stage and the traveling, because I want to go in a different direction as far as promoting and not being in a Center Stage, going outside of that and those events, those first times doing shows like Bash at the Beach, doing shows like Hog Wild and Sturgis, where you were you're not in a television ready place. You're not in a studio, you're outside. What were some of the biggest obstacles that maybe us as a viewer take for granted from a production standpoint or from a promotion standpoint, handling those outside events or places that just aren't specifically built to have events like that?
Well, I mean, you look at Bash at the Beach, I think the first one we did outdoors might have been in California, Southern California. That was kind of a low risk situation because the weather's almost always good.
Beach 95 is what George is telling me.
Yeah. So, anytime you do an outdoor event, there's variables you don't have control over. At a venue, you can control the weather. Can't control how many people show up, but you can control the weather. So when you're doing a show outside, not only do you always have that kind of awareness that you're not really sure how many people are going to show up until they do, but you've got the weather to deal with. Sturgis was another one. Sturgis was, God, if I was ever nervous, it would have been at Sturgis. Yeah. Because unlike Southern California, the weather in Western South Dakota is much like Orlando in the summertime. I don't know if you've ever spent any time in Florida in the summer, but you can set your watch to about 4:45 every afternoon, and you know there's going to be a thunderstorm because all that heat and humidity and stuff builds up during the day, and then as it rises, all that heat rises, it gets up into the colder atmosphere, and boom, you get a thunderstorm, right? It happens every day in Florida. You know it's going to happen. And you also know it's only going to last for about an hour and a half or 2 hours, and then the sun's going to come out and everything's going to be fine. You can predict it, right? In Sturgis, it was kind of the same thing. It wasn't as consistent, but you had kind of the same thermal effects, not to go all aviation weather on it, but you have the same kind of conditions where you had a lot of humidity in the air still in western South Dakota. It got really hot during the day. The heat rises, the moisture, the heat, and everything gets up into the upper atmosphere, and boom. I think either the first Sturgis we did, it might have been the second one we did. We got all setting up all day long. Now we're really outside there. I mean, you're out there. And we started getting reports that there's going to be severe thunderstorms in the evening, right about the time we're supposed to shoot our show. And we're watching the weather radar. I was a pilot at the time, so I had my own, access to certain types of aviation weather on my computer. So I'm watching my aviation weather because I understood that more than I understood Doppler radar and all that shit.
Right.
So I'm checking the upper wind patterns and all that kind of crazy shit, right? And I'm going, man, this is going to be horrible. And there were other people too that had their own weather kind of monitoring systems, more sophisticated than mine. And they were coming to me and saying, hey, bro, you need to think about maybe postponing the show by at least an hour or two. Well, that's a little hard to do with a pay-per-view because you've got satellite time booked, you promoted it. I mean, that raises all kinds of other issues, as I learned when you go off the air early, for example.
Right.
So I knew that wasn't doable. And literally, I remember 45 minutes before the show was supposed to start, this just mucker futher of a hailstorm came in. It was like 50-mile-an-hour winds, hail the size of small, probably tennis balls, at least. And they were whipping, man. When I say 40 to 50-mile-an-hour winds, I'm not exaggerating. That's not uncommon, around the mountains. So where I live, a 40, 45-mile-an-hour wind day is kind of commonplace after about November 1st. But it was just brutal. And I'm watching giant monitors flapping around in the wind. I'm watching giant steel trusses that rigged all of our lighting. They're weaving back and forth like some kind of a fucking horror movie. It was just god awful. And there was no backup.
Right. Yeah. I was going to ask. So was there a backup?
All our shit, jump on our bikes and let's just, go to Minneapolis. We were there. And sure enough, like 20 minutes before the show started, the skies opened up, the sun came out. You could have never told anything happened, but it got a little hairy.
Yeah. So were you feeling nervous or excitement during that time?
No, I was fear. That's another
level. There was no backup. There was
no backup.
Woo! That's bold.
It's fun though, man. That's what gray hair is made out of.
Well, that leads me to to something that I want to talk about, because of course any live production is always nerve-wracking, but it's so fun. That's what makes it great. My question to you is, a lot of times promoters will determine the success of a show based on the money that's made or the gate that's made. Was there a show that you did that you can recall that maybe financially it wasn't the most successful, but for you, Eric Bischoff, just you're really proud of, that you really liked, even though maybe it wasn't the most successful?
Yeah, and I think Sturgis is another good example. I took a lot of heat for Sturgis when I did it. Bischoff, he just likes to ride motorcycles. He just wants an excuse to go to Sturgis and ride with his buddies, all that kind of juvenile shit.
Yeah.
But there was a strategy involved. We were attracting sponsors and advertisers. The automotive industry was one of the biggest advertisers in television. And we couldn't sell advertising to the automotive industry to save our lives. The perception among the advertising agencies that represented those automotive companies just looked at wrestling like, oh, you don't have it, they're toothless bastards. They just chew tobacco and drink cheap wine and sleep at ringside. We're not going to advertise in wrestling. None of that was true, but that was the perception. And I wanted to change that perception. What better way to change the perception of those in the oil and gas industry than to stage a live event at the largest motorcycle rally in the world? What better way to change the perception and to make an impression amongst advertisers like Ford, Dodge, General Motors, certainly Harley Davidson, and every oil and gas manufacturer out there who were spending tons of money positioning themselves in Sturgis to take advantage of the 600 or 750,000 motorcyclists that came into Sturgis for 10 days every summer. So if these big advertising agencies in the companies they represented were spending tens of millions of dollars over that 10-day period of time in that little town of Sturgis because they wanted that audience, well, I wanted to be a part of that. I wanted WCW to be a part of that, to change the perception of the automotive industry and their ad agencies. And imagine that, shortly thereafter, we started getting oil and gas sponsorships. Shortly after that, we got involved with NASCAR. It worked very well. So while from a critical point of view, from a wrestling person's point of view, a wrestling fan's point of view, or worse, the dirt sheet writers who thought they knew everything that I was doing and why, to them, it seems stupid. Why would you give up the gate? Oh, damn, why would you give up the gate? Well, because I believed, I shouldn't say I knew, I didn't have a crystal ball, but I firmly believed that if we were successful over the course of a couple of years, we would probably in aggregate be able to attract $3 to $5 million worth of advertising every year that we wouldn't, in sponsorship, that we wouldn't otherwise get. So will I give up $100,000 in ticket sales to potentially see a year or two later $3 million in sponsorship and advertising? Pretty much every day, all day.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny enough with that one, just side personal story. My dad wasn't a big pro wrestling fan, but he loved motorcycles. And I was watching the show. He says, "Hey, that's Sturgis." And that was one of the only shows he sat down and watched the whole thing with me. So for whatever that's worth, you got a viewer for a day from my dad on that one. Now, this show, again, we talk about promoters. The idea is talking about promoters. Not all of them are going to be at the level that you're at. And so I want to talk to you a little bit about recruiting wrestlers, recruiting talent. And I want to know if you have a way of looking at talent, evaluating talent, or at least if you did have a way of looking at talent that isn't necessarily major stars. Because obviously you look at a Hulk Hogan and you say, yeah, of course I'd want him in the locker room. Of course I want to bring him on. But when you're filling out the other wrestlers, like the mid card, the other people, did you have a way that you looked at talent? Was there something you looked for in wrestlers or in talent or in people you brought on that weren't already established names?
Oh, I think so. Confidence. I don't think you can be a great performer in any kind of performance art, whether it's music or acting or dancing or being a magician, like David Copperfield. I think you have to have a lot of confidence, or a stand-up comedian, for example. If you don't have a ton of confidence, you're not going to last long. So one of the first things that I always look for, and this is true to this day, and I think it's true in life, it's not just wrestling, but if I'm contemplating working with somebody on a project, so one of the first things I notice, there's two things. One is, were they on time for the meeting? Because that to me says everything about someone's character in terms of how they respect other people. So I always pay attention to if someone is on time or not. I know that sounds like a pet peeve, but it's really not.
I agree with that, by the way.
The other thing I look for is confidence. Because if you've got somebody that's got great work ethic, that has respect for the people they're working with, and you know that because they showed up on time, if they've got self-respect and respect others, and they've got a lot of confidence, you can build on that. If they're possibly lacking in mic skills, promo skills, for example, you can teach that to someone with confidence. It's harder to teach it to someone with no confidence or little confidence. But if you give me somebody that has a strong desire and self-confidence with no experience, I can work with that. We often hear, and I think in any form of entertainment, that it factor, that magical, mystical, unicorn-like quality that some people just have. I think that's confidence. I think that's creativity. I think that's a positive attitude. I think all of those things in combination have a lot to do with the it factor. So I look for those things in combination. Obviously, skill set that, basic minimal skill set requirements, of course. But first and foremost, it was all because I've met a lot of people that had a lot of great skills that lacked a lot of other things, and you can't fix that. They either lacked the respect or whatever, or the confidence in many cases, and they overcompensated it with other things. But those are the basics that I look for. Just self-respect, respect of others, confidence, and desire and ambition.
Do you think someone can learn confidence? If someone's not confident when you first meet them, do you think they can turn that around, or is it something they have to be born with?
Absolutely. Absolutely they can. It's always easier and faster to work with somebody that comes through the door with a lot of confidence. If it's a healthy confidence, sometimes people can come through the door with an unhealthy level of confidence, thinking they're actually better at something than they really are. I've been guilty of that myself a few times, by the way. But if it's people say, "Oh, he's got such an ego." Fuck yeah, I've got an ego. Hopefully it's a healthy one, because I think ego is part of it. My ego refuses to allow me to be late for a meeting. That's my ego. Pride, self-respect. To me, that's all ego. And I could be wrong. I'm not a psychiatrist or psychologist, so I don't know what the actual definition of ego is. But to me, ego is all of those things. And I think having a healthy ego is incredibly important, because I think that ego is the sum of those parts that we just discussed.
I think you make a good point too.
I never minded if someone had a good, healthy ego, but if someone came in overconfident and cocky, and I could see it, and I knew that they were overcompensating, they'd lose my attention pretty quick.
Yeah, and I think you make a lot of good points there too, because I think a healthy ego means you want to put on a good show every time. You want to do a good job every time, because your ego can't handle not doing a good job.
Absolutely.
So I definitely agree. Now, assuming, let's put you in the shoes of a promoter who is trying to get some good wrestlers on a part of their show, some talent part of their show. But let's say you don't have the biggest budget in the world. What are some things as a promoter you would do to try to attract talent if you can't necessarily win bidding wars for people, or you don't have a huge budget? Is there anything as a promoter you could give as advice to say, hey, maybe this is how you can get the people you want on your show without paying an arm and a leg? Or is there a way?
I always have the luxury of paying an arm and a leg, so I don't know.
Fair enough.
Just gotta be honest about it, right?
Yeah.
I have no experience in that whatsoever.
Right. Well, it's fair enough. Well, let me pivot to a different question then. And this one is, I guess you talked about having the ability to pay an arm and a leg. That means, of course, you famously brought in a lot of big names into WCW. How did you manage the locker room during this time, and managing, similar to yourself, I guess, people who were incumbents? They've been there forever. They've been putting in the time. They've been putting in the work. And then now some new person comes in and they look like they're going to be the star. Was there anything you did to help balance the egos in that locker room and maybe make sure people weren't too offended? Or was it like, hey man, sorry, they're stars. They're going to be at the top of the card?
No, I was fortunate. before I took over WCW, even while I was, an announcer there, the top talent staying, Lex Luger, Steiner Brothers, handful of others, were making good money. A lot of guys were, Sting and Luger were making great money. Everybody else was making pretty good money. Flair was making damn good money. Everybody else was hovering in that kind of better than a real job, but you're not going to retire kind of money. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
But for a long time before I got into management, there was always this feeling that Turner could pull the plug at any minute on WCW. And it wasn't just a feeling, it was a fact.
Mm-hmm.
There were a lot of people within the Turner corporate environment, for example, on the board of directors or the executive committee, leadership groups, that didn't want WCW. They made no bones about it. It wasn't a real secret in the corporate boardroom. It was out there. There were people petitioning loudly and publicly about just pulling the plug on WCW. So there were a lot of talent there that some of them were making great money. Some of them were just making good money. There were always a little job scared. There was part of them was that, it's Turner. And as long as, we're getting television ratings, none of it ever really matters. And then you would hear from somebody, on the business side across the CNN center, you'd get the bad news.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was part of it. There was, I don't want to say people were job scared, but they were job aware. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
But then there was the pride, there was the ego. Guys like Sting and Flair and Luger and a lot of the others, they were going out and showing up at a live event in Baltimore and drawing 600 people where the WWF was drawing 6,000.
Right.
That's kind of a kick in the balls, right? It's kind of
right.
like, well, geez, I guess I'm not as good as my paycheck says I am, kind of thing.
Right.
And that was probably more of the prevailing feeling than anything when I took over. So that when I brought in Hogan, those same people across the board were thinking, wow, maybe there's a chance that business will pick up. They weren't going to make any more money. They were under guaranteed contracts. They weren't going to make any less money. But their egos would probably feel better if they could go out and perform in front of 1,500 people or 2,000 people or 3,000 people or 60,000 people in the Georgia Dome, as opposed to 600 fucking winos at the venue in Anderson, South Carolina.
Right.
So there wasn't the jealousy that people would expect there to be when I started bringing in some of those big names. Now it did manifest, in time. Once everybody got used to those big houses, once everybody got used to all that success, once everybody got used to being the #1 wrestling company on television, once everybody got used to all that stuff that they never experienced before, then you started getting then politics started to become an issue. But in the beginning, it really wasn't.
Now, something I wanted to ask about as well is recently we've heard a lot about diversity in pro wrestling and how some companies may have less diversity at the top of the card versus more diversity at the top of the card. My question is, as a promoter, is making sure that diversity is a part of your show and at top levels something that should be top of mind or actively focused on? Or do you believe like, hey, whoever's selling the most tickets, that's all I care about? Or do you think there should be a more proactive approach to making sure it's a diverse main event scene at a company these days?
It's so different. I mean, today diversity should be at the top of your must-do list for a lot of reasons. I'm trying to put myself back into the mid-90s. To me, I'm not trying to make myself sound like an advanced person by any stretch of the imagination, but just look back at the decisions I made long before diversity became a topical issue in our culture.
Mm-hmm.
I put forth a great effort and wrote a lot of checks to bring in the luchadors to make them an important part of Nitro. Same for what I did with New Japan. Now, I wasn't the first person in WCW to bring, talent over from Japan. I was the first person who did it on a consistent basis and within a storyline framework, as opposed to just, hey, twice a year, we're having this guy come over and he's going to wrestle Ric Flair. Cool. Right. That's an attraction. I integrated, for lack of a better term, I used diversity creatively over an extended period of time to change the look and feel of my show. Not because I was ahead of my time when it came to racial relations or anything like that, but damn, it just kind of makes sense, doesn't it? You know? If the idea is to build as wide of an audience as you possibly can, why would you not include as diverse of a roster as you possibly could? Now, as I sit here in 2021 and say that to you, it would be easy for somebody that listens to the show or watches this to say, oh yeah, he's just trying to make himself look good. No, I actually did it back at a time when there was no pressure on me to do it. I did it because I thought it was the right thing to do. Because if you want to appeal to a broad audience, then you have to have a broad spectrum of talent. It just makes sense. And I think now today, the importance and need for diversity is more apparent for different reasons. But my reasons still hold up too. It still just makes sense to me. Right.
Well, and that WCW Cruiserweight division, people still talk about it and how great that was and all the people that were a part of that. Speaking of bringing in a lot of people, what are your thoughts? I want to ask real quickly on the phrase that gets thrown around on wrestling Twitter and whatnot, stockpiling talent, and this idea of signing as many people as possible. Obviously, we are in a situation right now where there's a lot of big names that are free agents and whatnot. Without going into the minutia of that, do you have an opinion as a promoter? Should you, if someone's available and they're great, sign them regardless because they're great talent? Or do you believe in hey, you've only got a certain number of people, just kind of stick with that size locker room? Or do you have a theory or an approach on how you handle a lot of great talent being available?
It's not as simple as either or. It all depends. I mean, if you're, well, just talk about Tony Khan for a moment, because he's signing a lot of talent.
Right.
Here's a new company that's had significant early success, is starting to create some momentum, and they bring in CM Punk. Needle mover. I'm sure it's going to be a needle mover. How much? We'll find out in the weeks and months and year or two to come. But as of this moment, I think anybody that's thinking clearly is recognizing that here, even though AEW had a boatload of talent on the roster already, are you not going to take advantage of that opportunity because you've got a chock full roster and you're developing some great talent? You've already got some great talent and you're developing more and they're growing and they're gaining momentum. Do you say to yourself, no, I've got all the people that I need right now, so I'm just going to let that one go? No, you're going to take advantage of that. If Daniel Bryan is available and you know that there is another person in maybe not as much as CM Punk, because CM Punk's got this kind of, he's got this mythical kind of vibe to him, right?
Right.
There's a word for that, like it escapes me right now.
Like an aura or something.
Yeah, he's just got this thing, and a mystique, if you will, for lack of a better term. And that mystique, you can use that mystique and you can build on it. You can take advantage of that mystique and create even more momentum. I don't think that Daniel Bryan has the same level. He does. He has his own mystique and he has his own following for sure. Big following. But he's not that elusive kind of character that CM Punk has been. over the last 2 years. But are you going to say, no, I've got CM Punk, so I got a pretty full roster. I guess I don't really need Daniel Bryan? Or are you going to try to do a deal with Daniel and figure it out? If you have to let a couple people go in order to make room,
right?
Kind of how the world turns, unfortunately for some, but fortunately for others. So you make room, but I would never subscribe to the theory of stockpiling talent just for the sake of stockpiling talent, because that talent will get pissed off after a while, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
What you start out with is guys going, now on the lower end of the economic scale, those young talents that just get to sign a contract and say they're making a living in the professional wrestling business, and they get to tell everybody they're signed with a wrestling company and all that, they're going to be happy with that for a while, 6 months, 8 months, or a year. And then they're going to get used to the money, because we all do. No matter how much money you make, you get used to it after a while. And once that wears off and you realize your friends and family aren't seeing you on TV, they're seeing all these new guys that are coming in, all these big names that are coming in. Guess what happens to that talent over time? They all get together and they start bitching. Oh man, I thought we were going to get a shot. When am I going to get my shot? When these old guys going to get out of the way and make room for the young stars? Oh my God! If I had a nickel for every time I said that, I'd be on a beach throwing fucking coconuts at tourists. But that's what happens when you have too much talent that you're not utilizing, or there's no hope that you're going to be utilizing them. Then that stockpile talent can become, from an attitude perspective, it can get kind of malignant fast, and it can spread quickly. So that's the downside. I said early on, the great thing about Tony, he has the ability, Tony Khan, to bring in some of these big names. He's got the resources to do it. He's got the platform to take advantage of it. He's got the momentum now. But at some point, you're going to have talent in the middle of that pack, in my estimation. I could be wrong. I hope I am, actually. I hope I'm wrong about this. But at some point, when the newness wears off and the buzz wears off, it's going to always come down to, but what about me?
Mm-hmm.
And that's when, if you don't manage that properly, it can become a challenge.
Do you think that's something then, obviously you don't know the contract situations of everyone backstage, but do you think right now, if we can, I guess, assume or project, do you think right now that in AEW with these new signings are similar to WCW? We're like, hey, a rising tide raises all ships. This is great. Or do you think that they should be doing some preemptive work, talking to the talent to make sure that people don't get a little bummed about their spot maybe not being where they thought it would be at this point?
Well, I think you always have to communicate, and you do have that. Look, there's a honeymoon period, 6 months to a year, because all the boats are rising with the higher tide, and everybody's excited about that. Everybody feels good about that. They have more confidence in their company. They have more confidence in their position within the company as a result, until they don't.
Right.
Until they get used to it. And then if you're not communicating to that talent, if you're not communicating that you're trying to create opportunities for them, if they don't see down the road that there's going to be an opportunity for them, if you don't communicate to them, it only exacerbates the situation. It makes that it makes the fun wear off faster when people don't know where they're going.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I can make analogies all day long. It's like, you throw your kids in the car. Hey, we're going on vacation. Yay, we're going on vacation. 12 hours later, you're in the fucking middle of Nebraska. And you got to pee, and you don't know where you're going. Dad, are we almost there? Fucking, I don't even know where we're going yet. Shut up. Eat a cracker.
It's a surprise.
Yeah. The fun wears off pretty quick. So.
Well, I want to ask, as a, again, thinking of promoters maybe that are new and looking at, I think for a lot of promoters, if you're not already on like network TV or don't already have a TV deal, the idea is to always think about distribution. And that's kind of what we started with. My question to you right now is if you're part of a new promotion, let's say, and you're trying to get going and trying to get distribution, network TV still seems to be the king of distribution, but do you think that maybe nowadays, looking at streaming, do you think streaming is going to eventually pass that network those network deals, or do you think that that's something that wrestling
I've been saying that for 2 years or more. Yeah, look, network TV. If you're a young promoter starting out, or you inherited a boatload of cash, and you think you're going to be the next Vince McMahon or even Tony Khan, and you're going to buy your way into network television or even cable television, call me. Yeah. I'll save you I won't make you any money, but I'll save you a fortune because I'm going to talk you out of doing that. It's not how you do it. Now, obviously, Tony had, whatever I read somewhere, that they had committed $100 million as a startup fund for AEW. Well, that's a lot of money, right? Mm-hmm. You can buy a lot of highway. You buy yourself a lot of rope for $100 million, right? You have the time to build. You have to have all the other things. You have to be smart. You have to have a vision. And you have to have a lot of other things. But when you've got that kind of time and those kinds of resources, the odds are fairly decent you're going to eventually be successful. But unless you have that kind of money to invest, there's not a chance, there's not an ice cube's chance in hell that you're going to end up with a television deal. You're just not. Mm-hmm. And I think Booker T's got a great thing going down in Houston. Yeah. He's got local television. He's got his training facility. They're working together hand in hand. They could probably do some live events. And he's basically got a version of what used to be a regional territory, right?
Right.
That's the way to go. And then as you build that and you start building crowds and you start getting a following, and a following can be 400 people. Mm-hmm. It doesn't have to be 40,000 or even 4,000. As you're starting, if you're putting on an event once a month and you're getting 600, 700, 800 people to your event, by all means, start streaming it. Right. Build it up from there. And yeah, definitely. Streaming is accessible. Streaming platform, you can put it on YouTube. Build it up from there. If it gets hot and all the things that you're doing everything right, you get a little lucky and you're smart and all those things, huge success on YouTube could land you, on a spot on a bigger platform or even a smaller cable outlet. But to shoot for network television or even major cable television as a startup, don't do it. Please don't do it.
Well, I have kind of a broad question for you as far as, again, thinking about putting on shows. It seems that sometimes we always talk about, or you hear people talking about how you need to get people who are involved outside of wrestling to come in and be a part of wrestling shows and try to expand the audience that way. But it feels like more and more media is becoming more niche as time goes on. Do you think if you were promoting a show, should you lean on the fact that, hey, this is a wrestling show, we do wrestling, and we're going to focus on that niche? Or do you think that you should say, hey, we got to get a musical guest to attract different fans and do things outside of wrestling to bring outside wrestling fans in this day and age? I feel like wrestling's done the broad strokes for a while, but I don't know. I just look at media today and it feels more and more that people want specifically what they're looking for. Am I crazy, or what do you think about that?
No, I don't think you're crazy. I mean, you brought up some great points. Television is becoming more of a niche market every single day. It's becoming more and more fragmented, more and more specialized every single day. That is true. But what's also true is you're still appealing, yes, to your fans, yes, to your viewers, yes. But you're still, if you're in television, you're still appealing to advertisers. Mm-hmm. And in order to appeal to those advertisers, you have to have a product that appears to be, even if it's just from a perception perspective, a broader appeal than just a wrestling audience. Mm-hmm. Again, we're talking a lot of, we all know WWE, the list of celebrities, I don't even know how many celebrities they brought in over the decades. Right. I brought in a fair amount of celebrities. We talked about Kiss last week on the podcast. Mm-hmm. Kevin Green, Pittsburgh Steelers, mm-hmm. Dennis Rodman, Chicago Bulls, Karl Malone, Utah Jazz in the middle of the playoffs. I brought in a lot of celebrities and people outside of wrestling, not so much for the wrestling fan, but to attract other viewers and to create a buzz, to get people talking about our industry who weren't necessarily used to talking about our industry. That's how you broaden your appeal. That's how you create buzz. That's how you create awareness. Buzz and awareness, I guess, the same thing. But
yeah,
so I still think judicial use of celebrity talent is crucial. It lends credibility with the fans and with more importantly, with advertisers and potential sponsors.
That makes total sense. And I know you're a busy guy, so I don't want to take up too much of your time, but I do have one more question I want to ask you. Let's take you back. Let's assume you're, back at WCW, you're running the show. I want to ask you, if someone was looking to get hired by Eric Bischoff, if you were a wrestler looking to get signed by Eric Bischoff, if you were a commentator, an announcer, whatever, a cameraman, and they wanted to get hired by Eric Bischoff and be a part of a big company, what do they do? Do they, I guess, I mean, it's different nowadays. Like, do they DM you on Twitter? Do they send you an email? Do they what's kind of the process to get signed by an Eric Bischoff?
I don't think there's any single approach, I guess, or there wasn't back then. I didn't go out and try to hire a lot of talent. That wasn't my role. I relied on the Ric Flairs and Terry Taylors and Mike Grahams and Kevin Sullivans and the people who were more familiar with some of that developing talent or talent that wasn't necessarily on my Richter scale or on my radar. Those are the guys that were out looking to bring in talent, and I relied on their recommendations. Now, there were exceptions, I mean, I pursued Ernest Miller, the Cat. I had to sit down. I took like 2 lunches or 3, or I had to convince him to join WCW because he really wasn't interested. He couldn't see it.
Yeah.
He never thought about being in wrestling business prior to meeting me and getting to know me. And then after we became friends and got to know each other for a while, I was like, man, you've got to be in the wrestling business, dude. He's got so much personality. And he was a gifted athlete. I knew he could learn how to wrestle because he had all those other qualities that I talked about earlier. That's the real gold mine, right? If you've got those things, we can get you to learn how to wrestle. You may not be Bret Hart or Chris Benoit or Eddie Guerrero, but damn it, we'll get you good enough to make a great living in this business. But that was the case because I knew Ernest. I got to know Ernest, and I saw all those qualities in him where I actually had to pursue him. But I think with anybody else that ever approached me about coming in, I've always admired people that just found a way to crack the code. Especially in wrestling, because if you're an outsider, damn, it's kind of a mystery. Where do you apply? Can I get an application? Who do I need to know? You've got to be really determined to figure out how to get an appointment with somebody that can make a decision inside the wrestling industry. And I always admired people just instantly that found a way to crack that code, whatever it was. If it meant having to go, intern for an executive at Turner Broadcasting for 6 months just so that they could get a recommendation from that executive that they were interning for. I mean, that's something I was, okay, son of a bitch. If that person's willing to do that, I want to have a conversation with that person. So just initiative, creative initiative and tenacity. I think those are good qualities in any human being. And if someone demonstrated that, they would get my attention.
Yeah. Well, that sounds amazing. Like, I just appreciate all your time, Eric. I appreciate you being on the show. We appreciate you here at the Wrestling Chatter. Always fun to talk to you. Obviously, that's why you've got a show that does so well that everyone listens to, where you get interviewed. So
they just like Conrad, brother. Don't you don't have to blow smoke on my ass. They put up with me so they can listen to Conrad.
Hey, Conrad's okay too. I like listening to you, Eric. I appreciate you being on the show. That's 83 weeks for anyone who's watching this that doesn't know that. That would surprise me if you didn't know about that. But thanks again for being on the show. We appreciate it. This is the Wrestling Chatter. Yeah, hopefully we get to get you back on the show sometime. I feel like we could chat about this all day.
Anytime, guys. I'll do anything for you guys anytime you need it.
All right. Appreciate it.